Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Hey friends, we need your help. In order to help keep this show going, we need to hear back from you. Please take some time and check out our evaluation. Let us know if you like the show, and especially let us know if you've used any of the information you've gained from our show. Once again, you can reach us directly. You can call Karen at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Or you can reach Dan at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan.
So, I heard you got a soil test done.
Yeah, I did. Woohoo!
Yep. And I bet your hands were nice and cold, and you had to run back inside to warm them up before you got everything ready.
Let me tell you, digging a soil test in frozen soil is difficult. But the good part of frozen soil is that you can spread some lime.
That's right. Yeah. When it comes to any amendments that need to be done after the soil test, frozen ground is usually safe ground to drive on that you can then apply the nutrients as necessary. Of course, you're limited by when you do the soil test as far as what you can apply at the proper time, right? Timing is a very important part of a fertility program in general. But one of the most important things can be applied now and should be applied now. That's something we're going to talk about today.
That's right. We're going to talk about lime today, and specifically agricultural lime. We're not talking about those slightly sweet, slightly sour fruits that you get from Florida this time of year, but we're talking about what you put out on your fields to help adjust the pH of your soil. You know, the pH is really critical in helping plants thrive. And so when you are growing plants or livestock, which eat plants, you need to start with the soil. So you've gotten your soil test done. Awesome. Good job. That is step one, is knowing what your soil needs and knowing where it's starting from. Now, a lot of the soils in this area tend to be acidic, and that's basically because of what the parent material is made out of. So the parent material around our soils had very little limestone in it, very little calcium availability, and so there tend to be more acid. And, that's great for having available coal seams and things like that, but not so great when you're trying to grow plants. And so as our soils weather over time and the moisture leaches through the soil, it dissolves some of those particles. And that's why you have to keep applying lime every couple of years, because you're like, well, I've adjusted it. It should be fine. I'm not taking any lime out of my soil. But what happens is it just kind of, as the soil decays more and more because time passes and water leaches over it, that acidity goes back, I guess I would say, down again.
Yeah.
So your soil gets slightly more acid over time.
Right. And it really starts with the bedrock. You look at soils on the eastern side of Ohio versus the western side of Ohio. And what you'll find is as you dig deeper on the west side of Ohio, you find more alkaline soil. So your pH kind of goes up as you go down. And then over here, as you dig down, it becomes more acidic. So your pH actually drops. So the lower the pH, the more acidic, and the higher pH, the more alkaline.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It's very dependent on where you're living, because over in the Eastern Panhandle, we have a lot of more calcareous soils. We have a lot of karst topography, and the presence of the limestone in the soil there will make it more neutral or even more basic. So there is a sweet spot for growing plants, especially the ones we're most interested in, which are legumes and forages for livestock, because we are a livestock producing region. So when we're looking at our sweet spot for soil pH, we really want it to be above 6.0 or even above 6.5 if you want to like grow alfalfa or something. But we do still want it to be below 7 or 7.2 is that high end of unhappiness for plants. But so from 6 to 6.8, really, I would say is our sweet spot. Would you agree with that, Dan?
Oh, yeah. When we talk about forages in general, and honestly, most plants, with some exceptions, and alfalfa is kind of one of those exceptions where it really likes a more neutral soil pH, like 7.
And blueberries and potatoes are at the other end. They like a more acid soil. So there are definitely exceptions.
Right. And most plants do like it slightly acidic. So, which is kind of that 6.5 area. And then when you do a soil test, what's nice about a soil test is it's a very analytical process where they actually look at your soil composition. And your soil composition is also going to be part of that chemistry. A lot of times when we talk about pHs, we talk about chemistry. And that's just because that's exactly what it is. A lot of reactions of chemicals and what your soils are made of. You got the rain coming down, you have organic matter in there, and all those interactions create usually acidifying conditions, which is one of the reasons why your soils tend to bounce back after you've either neutralized it or sometimes acidify it, depending on what side of the state you're on. But yeah, typically slightly acidic is where most of the nutrients are available. And that's one of the reasons why we say it's the most important nutrient, because even though plants don't take up that bicarbonate, calcium bicarbonate's what lime is, what it does is it allows the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and even all the micronutrients, some of the elements like certain metals that are essential, like iron, and makes them available for the plant to take in. So by just adjusting that chemistry, by neutralizing some of the acidity in this case on this part of the state, what you're doing is you're freeing up all those nutrients that were bound to the soil previously. And the nice thing about the soil test is that it does look at the composition of your soil. So when they run it through a machine, find the buffering capacity of your soil, which is it's everything that makes up your soils to keep it a certain chemistry. And in our case, typically it keeps it acidifying. So what it'll do is it'll calculate how much bicarbonate is necessary, or lime, to one, overcome that buffering capacity and to actually shift that pH. So you will have success and you will be able to change that chemistry. Otherwise, if you under apply the recommendation based on the lab, it's not like you're gonna raise the pH halfway there necessarily, but you're probably going to do yourself a disservice, because applying half the amount isn't going to give you halfway to the benchmark. It might just bump it up 10% because of that buffering capacity. So what we like to say is when the amount of lime that comes back is much higher than expected, and maybe it's not in the budget to do that whole field, instead of halving everything, just apply it the full amount to half the field is probably the best way to go about that.
To a point, once you get over, 2.5 tons of a lime per acre, then you start to have problems with it becoming incorporated, because you're just putting this layer upon layer of this powder on the soil. And so if, let's say, your lime recommendation is 4 tons per acre, then well, maybe you're going to put half of it on now and then half of it on in a few months.
That's absolutely true.
Just to help incorporation.
I didn't even consider that, but there is like a maximum threshold of lime that it's just too much for the soil to take in all at once. So that's absolutely true. 3 tons is what I've heard is kind of the maximum threshold.
Okay.
So you should never apply more than 3 tons.
Yeah.
And that might be, that's kind of really high end. So even if you're kind of nearing that amount, you might want to just maybe apply half one year and then half the next year, because liming, much like well, I shouldn't say much like, but much different than a lot of the recommendations you get back in a soil test. Liming is typically a 3-year recommendation. So we talked about the soil kind of reverting back to what it should be, just kind of the homeostasis, where as it rains, things leach out, the ground chemistry kind of takes over and it starts going back to what it was before. It's usually like the amount that's applied is usually good for 3 years.
Right. And, just to kind of drive home why you don't want to apply too much lime. If you think about in a pasture situation, this is an area you're not typically tilling. You're not incorporating the lime into the soil. You're just spreading it on the surface. And good agricultural lime is kind of like a powder. So if we have a windy day, it could blow over onto your neighbor's fields or into a creek where you don't want it. So you're depending on the worms and the other biota, frost heaving and everything else to slowly pull that lime down into the soil profile. So when you're depending on those natural interactions,
processes,
the natural processes, it's a slow thing. And so you don't want to overwhelm them by putting too much down. And so that's kind of where we're coming from with hey, don't put more than 2.5, 3 tons down at one time, break it up across 2 separate applications.
And this is a per acre application.
Yeah, per acre. Yeah. And I would say, at least 6 months between applications, really, it would be best. 3 months if your soil is really off and you got to get something growing. But I wouldn't do it less than 3 months. 6 months would be better. And you could go up to a year for that split application.
Yeah. And if it looks like there's 2 inches of snow in your pasture field, you're also kind of smothering a lot of those plants out too.
Yeah, we don't want that.
It's not good. Even though you could always make the argument, well, the plants are dormant, but they still don't want to be smothered out.
Yeah, they still need some sunlight. It's just like why you rake your leaves in your yard, right? You don't want to smother the grasses because even though they're not actively growing fast like they do in the summertime, they're still alive and they still need to eat. So if you leave your leaves down, then you're going to smother your grass. Now, we've made a conscious choice this year, and I'm sure my neighbors hate me for it, but we've left our leaves down because we're trying to encourage firefly habitat and solitary bee habitat. And so we're just going to replant the yard in the spring. But we've made that conscious decision. So when you're out in a pasture field, you're not making that conscious decision to say, I'm going to kill everything in my pasture field and replant it in the spring. You are trying to encourage the life that's already there.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things you did say, let's go back to our soil test here. You said ag lime. And then you mentioned fineness.
Yes.
And that's absolutely true. Like lime is calcium bicarbonate, and bicarbonate, it could be gravel, it could be something you're holding with your whole hand.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, all that chemistry, all those processes that Karen was saying about the worms, like put it in the ground, and just the environment breaking it down so that it can neutralize the acidity there. If it's too coarse, you're basically spreading pebbles on your field, and it won't react within 3 years. It might take 6 years. It might take 9 years, but what did we say? Like the soil is fighting back. So if you don't have something that can react faster than the soil is doing its own thing, then it's just going to sit there and you're just going to have pebbles on your pasture field in this case. Or, if you plan on planting something in the spring, like some kind of silage or corn or grain, you'll spend your money, you'll waste your time, and nothing will happen. So you have to make sure you get ag lime. And a lot of farmers know this, but when we talk about liming, that this applies to the small garden as well. So, when we talk about things as in 3 tons to the acre, I know that seems overwhelming if you have a 10 by 10 garden.
Yeah.
But you can calculate that down. So what you'll find is in a 10 by 10 area, you can over apply with just a few bags. So remember those numbers. And I think when you do specify in your soil test, they'll give it to you in 100 square feet.
Yeah.
As opposed to acres, just to kind of make it easier. But those numbers are interchangeable. You can scale up and scale down as necessary.
That's true. And if you don't want to do the math, it's really important to make sure when you're getting your soil test done that you specify that you want your results in pounds per 100 square feet versus pounds per acre. So, I mean, you can still do the math and get what you need, but think about that when you're submitting your soil test ahead of time. That'll make a big difference.
And you can always call us because I have done a lot of algebra in this field.
Yep. So listen up, kids. You do need algebra when you graduate.
Algebra is probably one of the things I've used more so than any other skill.
I've used geometry too, quite a bit. So, you got to calculate that area, right?
You do. Yeah. Yeah. You can't get away from anything.
Yep.
But it's possible, and once you do it once, you'll get the feel for it. A lot of times, it's just finding the units.
Yeah,
units can be very complicated, and whether you're trying to figure out how much slime to put down in an area, or whether how much liquid to put to dilute a pesticide into, it can be just very confusing. And you have to sit down, take the time, be patient, because that stuff is all very important. So.
Yeah.
Ag lime, right? Let's go back to this ag lime.
Yeah.
So you're at the co-op or not. And when you're not at the co-op, chances are you can get all kinds of lime. You can get lime has different uses. And you have to be very careful with that ag lime concept when you're buying it. When you're buying it anyway, whether you're in your co-op or not. But chances are co-ops are probably fine because they deal with agriculture and they know this. But if you don't see the grade ag lime, you have to look for a couple numbers. And I know in Ohio, it's law that you have to have the ENP value, which is the effective neutralizing power. And sometimes you also find a total neutralizing power. So when you're talking about ag lime, you'll have a total neutralizing power of 100. It's on a percentage basis.
I'm going to interrupt 1 second to say that ENP and ENV, which is value instead of power, are the same thing. It just depends on what state you're in. So go ahead.
Okay. ENP is what I'm used to seeing, but effective neutralizing power is a concept of ratios, and it's in pounds per ton, just like we've been talking about. So if you have a TNP of 100%, you have an ENP, so effective neutralizing power, of 2,000 pounds per ton. So that ENP number is 2,000. So if you can remember 100 and 2,000, that's what you're going to look for. Because I don't think I've ever seen an ENP value of 100. And if you do see that, you're basically hauling stone. So you'll probably understand that.
Well, it's pure calcium carbonate at that, right?
Well, no, I'm talking about ENP, not TNP.
Okay.
So at the ENP 2,000 pounds per at the ENP of 2,000 means that you have a TNP of 100%, and that's assuming a 0% moisture. So moisture can play a part in the TNP ENP ratios as well. But typically, if you're buying a dry bag of lime, TNP of 100, ENP of 2,000 is ag grade.
Right. There are other things that go into that neutralizing value or neutralizing power. And so you don't always get pure calcium carbonate when you're buying lime. You can get magnesium carbonate as well. And that magnesium will actually increase the neutralizing value of the calcium carbonate. And so if you're buying dolomitic limestone or
dolomitic hydrated lime or dolomitic lime, right? Or high mag.
High mag, that's what I was trying to think of. 1 pound of magnesium carbonate is going to neutralize the same amount of acid as 1.2 pounds of calcium carbonate. So you're going to need less overall of your dolomitic limestone than you will of your regular calcium carbonate limestone.
And there's dolomitic hydrated lime and there's dolomitic regular lime. And dolomitic hydrated lime is a little deceiving because it actually has no moisture in it. But the TNP of that one is 140%. And the ENP of dolomitic hydrated lime is 2,520.
Right. So basically, they've driven off the carbon dioxide from those particles so that they can have a greater neutralizing value. And so they've just done a chemical process to it, to like they heated it and took off some extra ions so that it can have a greater reaction in the soil. So you would need less of a hydrated lime than of a regular lime.
Yeah.
But it's more expensive.
So how would you figure this out when your soil test is based on a TNP of 100 or an ENP of 2000? Is that at 2500, you're using 20% less?
And if you're trying to figure out how much of what do I need and what is the cost ratio, how do I know which one's the best? There are lime calculators available online. We even have one on our WVU site. Those lime calculators can be helpful because they can tell you if you're going to buy hydrated lime for X amount of dollars and regular lime for Y amount of dollars, between the values of what you need, which one is going to get you a greater value overall. And you also need to take into account, though, especially if you have a large amount, the amount of passes you're going to have to make over the field. And so if you can apply less tons and get under that threshold where you need to go out twice, that could save you more money because you're not paying that diesel fuel and you're not putting those extra hours on your tractor and you're not taking more hours out of your day. So that can also play into that value assessment.
Yeah, and don't forget, sometimes there's moisture percentages in there, but that moisture percentage is going to be a factor in the ENP rather than the TNP. And I know I'm getting technical here, but by looking at that ENP value, you can figure out what's the best bang for my buck. Like Karen was saying, if a bag of the equivalent weight is 10% more, but like the example I was saying, if the ENP is 2,520, you're getting 20% more neutralizing power, the effective neutralizing power, then that bag that's going to be 10% more expensive is going to be cheaper in the long run because you're going to use less of it.
And something that goes into that ENV calculation or that ENP calculation, the effectiveness, is the size. And so we had talked about powders versus stones, but the size difference can really be impactful for how quickly it's incorporated into the soil. So when you're looking at lime, it's measured by a mesh screen. So the screen mesh or sieve size is the number of wires in a 1-inch length of screen. And so the larger the number of the mesh means more wires per inch, which means smaller holes in the sieve, right? So when you're looking at particle sizes, particles that pass through 100 mesh sieve, so 100 wires in that 1-inch length of screen, will be fully incorporated into the soil and react 100% within 6 months or less. But if you have a 60 mesh sieve, and so all your particles are passing through that 60 mesh or finer sieve, they're going to react 100% within the first year. And so you can think about if you're going to be planting a crop, or if you are going to be just letting your pasture work its magic, that those are going to make a big difference as far as if this soil is going to be right at planting time. But if you have, say, a 20 mesh, but they won't go through a 60 mesh, you're only going to get 50% of a reaction within that first year. And if they don't go through a 20 mesh sieve, that's when you're wasting your money and your time. So a 20% sieve is still pretty fine. And you're not talking like gravel for your driveway. It's still fairly fine. But because it's still in a larger particle form that can react with the microbes and everything that's going to be pulling it down into the soil, it's just not going to react fast enough to get you the result you're looking for. So 100 mesh sieve is going to be the most expensive. It's going to be a light, fluffy powder like flour, but it's going to react in 6 months or less. So if you're incorporating it into a cornfield to be able to plant in the spring, that's probably a good way to go. But if you're looking at something you're going to spread out over the field, maybe a 60 mesh sieve is going to be fine for you. But definitely don't get anything less than a 20 mesh sieve. And if it is less than 20 mesh, it is not allowed to be called ag lime. And in West Virginia, when you buy lime, they are required to give you an analysis of the lime you're getting. And if you don't think it is of the same quality that sheet says, you can contact the Department of Agriculture and they will come out and look at it and make sure that it meets the standards that it's saying that it's giving you.
And I want to touch on one thing that I think confuses a lot of people, especially if you're kind of new to the liming concept, and that's pelletized lime.
Yeah.
People are like, so I bought this lime, you on your show, you're talking about how it had to look like flour. And, these are like little pebbles.
Yeah.
The idea of pelletizing, the idea of pelletizing is you're putting a water soluble coating on that lime, and it's just easier to handle. It's easier to spread. It spreads more evenly. It works its way down through better.
It's not going to blow away.
And it'll dissolve. And once it dissolves, then you are left with that fine powder. So pelletized ag lime is fine. And it's also okay.
Yeah,
it's fine because it's fine ground.
Yeah, you're right. And that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because when it's in a pellet, you're like, oh, well, this obviously isn't what I want. But that pelletized lime is still acceptable for ag lime. It's just been given another process so that it's easier to spread and to handle, and you don't have that same powdery fluff, but it will be absorbed into your soil and is still definitely a good option.
And again, the key things there are ag lime and effective neutralizing power of 2,000.
Right. And so I had mentioned earlier a calculator that we have. If you go to the WVU Extension webpage for soil fertility and fertilizers, we have all sorts of really cool resources available to you. There is a calculator to help you blend your fertilizers. There's a calculator to help you determine the best ag lime. There's videos you can watch. There's quick guides you can download to have handy for whatever it is you're growing. And so soil fertility and fertilizers on the WVU Extension webpage, great resources, and there's some really cool calculators that you can download and use to help you make sure you are getting the best value for your dollar and, of course, getting the best impact.
That's right. And liming is one of the most important parts of the soil test. It's really where I typically see the most change as far as like any amendments that you're doing to your soil.
Oh, yeah.
It's usually going to have the biggest impact. And then the nice thing about liming is, we talked about these months that it takes sometimes to neutralize. That's why applying it in the fall is so nice. And then your other nutrients, like your nitrogens, you want to apply that at the time of growth if possible, because those do tend to move away. So if you apply them now, come spring, you'll end up with nothing.
Exactly. Yep. And that's why we use cover crops in the wintertime, because they grab onto them. But that is a topic for another show. Thanks so much for listening, and we will catch you next week. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.